There was this absolutely beautiful August morning last summer where my wife and I were completely content just walking our dog in the neighborhood. Our son was still asleep. Our youngest daughter was at a sleepover, and our middle daughter, Marin, was at a life teen retreat up in the mountains. So my wife and I had this rare moment as a couple where we got to reconnect and just enjoy being with each other outside until we got a phone call from the Life Teen retreat leader, Marissa. And Marissa said those words that every parent just longs to hear: "We have a problem." But those words hit stronger and deeper for me and my wife because we had watched Marin go through a lot of problems in the last year and a half. You see, she had a deep, dark depression, and we had had many scary nights in the hospital with her. And we had watched her go through lots of therapy and lots of counseling. We had also watched her pull as far away as she possibly could from the Catholic Church, even though she was preparing at this moment to make her confirmation in a couple of months. But we knew in that moment that that was not going to happen. And we felt like we had failed. And we felt like we didn't understand how everything that we had tried to do just wasn't working. And so we decided with Marissa that one of us would go up to the retreat center and pick Marin up the next morning. And I drew the short straw. I guess that's how I felt in the moment. But I was in the car driving up there the next morning. I turned off the radio and I just had a conversation with God. Actually, I was more complaining and whining to God. I said, "What am I supposed to do? How am I supposed to handle this? What am I even supposed to say when I get up there?" And do you know what I heard from God in that moment? Absolutely nothing. At least not then. Proverbs chapter 16, verse 9. "In his mind, a man plans his course, but the Lord directs his steps." You see, folks, surrendering is hard. As a business owner, I've learned a lot about needing to have positive control over certain situations in order to succeed. My father's mantra when I was growing up and as I was taking over the insurance agency that he started was, "Plan your work and work your plan." It's very simple, very powerful. Yes, it could work if you do it over and over. Just plan it and execute it. But then God's plan comes into play sometimes, and it doesn't always jive with what our plan is. Sometimes we have to be pushed to our limits in order to surrender. And certainly that moment in the car, I was at those limits because my resistance point was the fact that I needed to have control over how Marin got better and what happened in her life. But God had other plans. There's a friend of mine, DJ, who is becoming a police officer. He's one of the core members for Life Teen, one of the adult leaders. And I think about him when I think about surrendering because as a police officer, I'm sure he's got lots of tools at his disposal to be able to help someone surrender if they're not going to do it on their own, like blocking them in with his car or using handcuffs or pepper spray. Why would it take so many drastic measures to get someone in that situation, and whatever situation it is, to surrender? Because people don't want to give up control. And actually, people are terrified to give up control if you think about it. And Jesus was feeling the same way in the Garden of Gethsemane. He knew what God's plan was, but he knew it so well that he knew that he was about to die. And the only way that he could fulfill that plan was by being crucified. And so in his anguish, he was actually sweating blood. But he knew that he had to fulfill the plan. And the only way that he could do it was to go through with it. The Catechism of the Catholic Church in chapter 28-24 says, "In the prayer of his agony, he consents totally to this will, not my will, but yours be done." We know surrendering is hard, but what do we get out of it? What's in it for us if we do it? Have you ever seen this series on the History Channel called The Selection? It's a fantastic show where they take civilians and they put them through elite training, like for the military, for Marines or for the Army, whatever. I saw the season for the Marines when they're going through SEAL training, and it was crazy because they'll do insane things like putting them in a small box, locking them in there for hours and playing all kinds of noises and things to scare them. They'll tie them up completely so they can't tread water, and they'll make them bounce off the bottom of a pool for a few minutes, just trying to stay, alive. And that takes a lot of surrender. If you think about it, they have to completely surrender themselves to the plan and believe that the instructors are not going to let them die in that box or die in the pool. There's a really interesting part. I find it fascinating from a psychological perspective. The instructors will randomly come kidnap each of the participants at some point, throw a bag over their head, and take them off to an interrogation room. And when they pull the bag off their head, the instructor is standing there looking at them saying, "Why are you here?" And there's a lot of dramatic silence. And why are you here? They dig in. And the answers that these participants usually give at first are very surface level, like, I want to push myself, or I want to make my parents proud. But the instructors don't buy it. They push even further. They push them to the limits of surrender. And they end up realizing that they need to bring these doubts that they have in themselves out, and they start to get emotional and they cry. And they have past abuse that starts to surface, emotional, physical abuse. And ultimately, almost every single participant ends up saying something like, the reason they're there is because they want to fulfill who they were meant to be. My friends, that's exactly what happens when we surrender to God's will. When God asks us to be obedient to his will, he's inviting us into a stronger relationship with a Father who loves us and seeks to draw us into the fullness of who we were meant to be. All right, so we know that surrendering is hard. We know what we get out of it. So how do we discern what God's will for our lives is in order to surrender? Well, how do you discern anything in your life? You have to ask a lot of questions. You have to look for clues, search for patterns. You have to Scooby-Doo it. Think about this. If you've ever been in a murder mystery dinner or an escape room, what does it take to win either one of those? You have to ask those questions. You have to find the clues that are going to help you get out of that situation. So it is in our spiritual quest, my friends. We have to go through the same thing, asking questions, searching for clues and patterns through prayer. The Catechism, chapter 28-26, says, by prayer we can discern what is the will of God and obtain the endurance to do it. Just like those people on that show, they had to obtain the endurance to do it. Just like me and my wife having the endurance to go through what we went through with Marin and her depression. Now, at the end of this talk, I'll give you a simple and powerful prayer that can help open you up to surrendering to God's will and then discerning what that will is for you in your own life. Just remember that praying isn't a once and done thing, especially when we're asking for surrender. We've got to continuously do it so that we expand our hearts. As a matter of fact, God's sneaky, isn't he? Because sometimes he will delay giving us the answer to a prayer, what we want, in order that we would expand our hearts in the process. I want to say that again. God often delays giving us the answer to our prayers in order that we might expand our hearts in the process. How often have you asked God for something in your life and it took a long time for you to get not maybe what you wanted, but what you needed? You received that grace from him. And how much sweeter was it when he finally gave it to you and you had what you needed? We have to keep our ears and our eyes open, my friends, in order to discern. So back in the car, I was kind of letting my mind start to drift to when I was younger and thinking about how I started out in the Episcopal Church. I later became Catholic, but when I was growing up, I loved going to our youth group. I loved going on the retreats. I loved our youth leaders, and I wanted to be one. It's probably why I wanted to be a teacher earlier in my career too. I wanted to help form people. And I thought how that's just not going to happen now. Not now. It'd be fun to do that. It'd be awesome, but I can't do that with all these things that are going on with Marin, and I'm probably going to have to wait until my kids just get out of of the house and go off to college and have their own lives. So I walked into the retreat center, and this is when God hit me with a spiritual 2x4 right between the eyes. He finally answered the prayer, not necessarily with what I wanted, but with what I needed. I walked in, and the person that was giving the last talk of the day was Nathan. He's one of the core members of Life Team, one of the adult leaders, and he kept repeating this phrase, never let a struggle go to waste. Never let a struggle go to waste. I'm struggling. And then in that moment, I knew exactly what I needed to do. That resistance that I had to control everything about Marin getting better and where I wanted her to be, I just finally said, all right, God, I know this is crazy, but I know what I need to do. So I walked over to Marissa, and Marin was walking over to me, and I kind of put my hand out and I said, no, you go get your stuff. I got to talk to Marissa. And I walked over to her and I said, Marissa, I know this is going to sound really crazy, especially considering everything that has happened over the last 24 hours, but what would it look like if I became a Life Teen leader? And she kind of cocked her head like my Boston Terrier looks at me sometimes like, huh? But I said, Marissa, I have probably lost Marin in terms of her faith in the church, but I do not want to see another teen be lost. And even if I become a Life Teen leader and Marin never comes back to the church, I want to help others. I just want to do it. I'm surrendering to what I think God wants for me. And she said, well, you could become a Life Teen leader. And I said, I will call you. And so we got back in the car, and I thought, you know what? Whatever. Let's just keep surrendering. And I shared with Marin over the next hour or so my own faith journey, which I had never done before. And I don't know why, but in this moment, I felt called to do it. And I shared with her about how I started out in the Episcopal Church, but we stopped going to Mass, or stopped going to church as a family. And then, I never lost my faith, but I had these moments where I saw God in my life, and I wanted to be reconnected with him. Like when I was volunteering in high school with an after-school program, reading to kids in a really impoverished area of downtown Atlanta. And there was this one boy that would always grab a book and run and jump in my lap, and I'd read him a book. And we do that every single week, and we had so much fun laughing and reading these books together. And then one week I showed up and he wasn't there, and I said, where is he? And they said, you didn't hear? He was killed in a drive-by last week. And it was the first time in a while that I had wanted to be reconnected to God, saying, why? What's your plan in all this? And then how the first time I lost a family member that really was close to me, my grandfather, I was in college, and I was dating my now wife, and she took me to my first Catholic Mass on the campus of Boston College where we were going to school. And I was kneeling down, and suddenly things looked familiar. It was kind of like the Episcopal Church, and things sounded familiar, like when I used to sing in the choir at the church. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was home. And so I made my confirmation as an adult. I went through RCIA right after September 11th, 2001, which was the biggest class they had in a long time, because a lot of people were wondering, what is God's will in my life? And how after I made my confirmation, I went to my first Ash Wednesday service with my wife, and we went to a deli afterwards. And no, we didn't get meat that day, but we were standing in line, and there were some teenage girls standing in line pointing at us and laughing and saying, what is that? Oh, they're Catholic. They look so stupid. And I shared with Marin that this faith isn't always easy, but it is so worth it, because I see the happiness that you can have when you are happy, but you've been so depressed, but I see flashes of it, and that's all I want for you. And I said, Marin, I just walked up to Marissa and told her, whether Marin participates or not, I'm going to join Life Team, because I don't want to see another teen be lost and not be able to fully participate in this faith. And I had tears in my eyes at that moment. And she looked at me with tears in her eyes, and she said, Dad, if you join Life Team, I'll start going too. And maybe I will consider going ahead and making my confirmation. And praise God, that very night, it was a Sunday, we went to Mass as a family, and my wife had tears in her eyes as she watched Marin go up for communion for the first time in a long time and make the sign of the cross and sing the hymns. And it didn't stop there, because a few weeks later, after I become a Life Teen member, we had a debrief with the core leaders, the adult leaders. And afterwards, I couldn't find Marin. And by this point, she had started dating one of the teen leaders. And I thought, oh my gosh, she's run off with him somewhere and who knows what's going on. But turns out she was in the adoration chapel of our church praying with him. And the grace that God gave from her surrendering just kept coming and coming, and her faith is now on fire. And my faith has been even more rekindled, and I am much less stressed in my life. My wife and I are much more contented on a regular basis now because of what we see God doing in Marin's life and in our own lives. And I told you that I would leave you with a prayer that'll help you surrender in your own life. And it comes from the Surrender Novena. And it comes from the servant of God, Don Dolindo Ruotolo, who was actually St. Padre Pio's spiritual advisor and a good friend of his. And the prayer is very simple. Oh, Jesus, I surrender myself to you. Take care of everything. Oh, Jesus, I surrender myself to you. Take care of everything. Say it with me one time or in your head. Oh, Jesus, I surrender myself to you. Take care of everything. God bless you, my friends.